You know, speaking about people who don't like to pick on people their own size, a couple weeks ago I was talking about Jake Paul. So I was talking about Jake Paul and his fight with Nate Robinson, where he came in and he bullied a guy that wasn't ready to be a fighter. He came in, he trained a little bit as a boxer. He came in and he basically bullied a guy who didn't properly train for a boxer. A guy who was older than him, a guy that was retired as an athlete, a guy who didn't train properly, didn't even spar to be a boxer, who was smaller than him. And he came in and he knocked the guy out, and now he's walking around there, and he's out there, he's walking around like he thinks that he's some kind of a killer. And apparently the ease with which he's had success in the quote-unquote YouTube boxing game, oh boy, has really gone to his head, and he's become absolutely delusional. Because this week, Jake Paul did something, you know, it probably should be regarded as really, really stupid. I'm not actually entirely sure just exactly how stupid it really was, but he did a couple of things that were really stupid. And so on Monday, he released to the public a little bit of a video that he shot where he was calling out Conor McGregor, of all people, sticking with the MMA vein here. So Jake Paul shot a video where he was calling out Conor McGregor, and he said a few things that were, we'll just say they were pretty bland kind of stuff. But he also said a couple of things that were a little bit more serious about that, where he came out and said that, Conor McGregor won't fight me because he's afraid of me. You're afraid to fight me. You're afraid to lose to a YouTuber. Okay. Well, if you really think that. But then he went a little bit further than that. He basically said that, maybe you're spending too much time jerking off because you're tired of doing your wife because your wife is only a 4. Now, Jake Paul says that he has a backer for this fight. And that backer has put up $50 million in cash, great big check that Conor McGregor can go down and he can put in the bank. Now, you would think that that would be pretty enticing. And if you think that this sport is only about money, well, then you would be absolutely right about that. But I think that what Jake Paul is forgetting is that, like Conor McGregor, he already has money. He's already the wealthiest MMA fighter on the planet, mostly as a result of his huge payday that he got for fighting Floyd Mayweather. So while $50 million is obviously a lot of money, Conor McGregor, he doesn't need $50 million, and I'll bet that he probably wants another championship a lot more than he wants another $50 million. As a matter of fact, there's probably another $50 million in him winning another championship, rather than going and fighting some YouTube schlub. Yeah, but Jake Paul, let's just say that he seems to have some really funny ideas about what he thinks are more important than championships in the MMA game. What he thinks that money is more important than. He says in this video, he complains that Conor McGregor, he's going to fight Dustin Poirier in January. And that is basically, it's not explicitly so, but for all practical intents and purposes, that is a championship eliminator kind of situation. The lightweight championship of the world is currently vacant, and whoever wins that fight is going to have a rock-solid case to go on to be the guy to face somebody to fight for that lightweight championship, to occupy the place that Khabib Nurmagomedov, I did it again, but the place that Khabib just vacated. The UFC is out there looking right now for trying to figure out who's going to be that next guy. Whoever wins that fight is going to be is going to be a player in that picture. But Jake Paul, he doesn't really seem to understand the importance of that, and he comes out and he says, "Oh, well, you're fighting Dustin Poirier, and he has less Instagram followers than my dog." That is, that is not what the combat sports game is about, buddy. Okay, it's not about your Instagram. Okay, it's not about your Twitter. It's not about your YouTube. I mean, yes, in a big sense, it is about how much money you can put away in the bank, but at the end of the day, people don't remember who made the most money. People remember who won championships. That's what establishes your legacy. Hey, let's face it, Jake Paul, I mean, I understand that the WBC, they gave him some kind of belt or something so that he can walk around like he thinks he's a killer and he can walk around like he thinks he's a champion, but Jake Paul is not in any championship situation. He's not in any championship picture, and quite frankly, I severely have my doubts that he ever will be. Now, the thing is that while I do have my doubts about that, I'm not about to just go and take and put that in the bank, because, the one thing about boxing that actually kind of makes a lot of this, Jake Paul, Logan Paul, YouTube boxer bullshit that Mike Tyson actually does seem to think is so great because it's quote-unquote saving the sport. One of the reasons why they're doing this in boxing and not in a sport like MMA is because, quite frankly, boxing is vulnerable to this kind of stuff right now. Boxing as a sport, as an institutionally, it is in a lot of trouble. People just are not paying attention to it. And one of the biggest reasons why people aren't paying a whole lot of attention to it are things that you can actually see in this fight that happened just here on Saturday. The Rodriguez versus Garballo fight, where Rodriguez, he blew that guy away for 12 rounds. And yet somehow at the end of the fight, they get a majority they get a majority decision for the guy that won for the guy that was basically losing the fight the whole time. But now that guy's out there walking around with a belt, walking around with an interim championship that he basically got for losing a fight, and people wonder why it is that people are having such a hard time taking boxing so seriously. And then you wonder how it is that a guy like Jake Paul can come in and basically they bought their way into these big fights. They didn't go away and become good fighters and then come and become famous because they were such good fighters, because they were successful in the ring. They jumped on their YouTube channels, they acted like a jackass, went off to Japan and, took selfies with dead bodies in the suicide forest. And that was what got them famous, and that's what fuels their interest in the interest in them in terms of boxing. So now you've got these two guys walking around talking about like what big money stars they are, like what big money fighters they are, what prize fighters they are. And personally, I think that is actually what has so many of these actual legit fighters who have been in it for their entire careers, trained for it their whole lives, worked their asses off for it. I think that's actually part of the reason why so many of them are lining up to take their shots at Jake Paul. It's not because they think that there's any honor to be had in knocking out Jake Paul. No, there's nothing there. There's nothing there. There's no honor in it. There's no glory in it. But Jake Paul is this guy who just kind of shows up out of nowhere, and because he's YouTube famous, he thinks that he's just entitled to fight for millions of dollars. And meanwhile, there are all kinds of fighters out there who are twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times the fighter that Jake Paul and Logan Paul are. And a lot of them, they never get to that plateau. They never get to that point where they can fight for millions of dollars. And if they ever do get there, they will have worked their entire lives to get to that point. And Jake Paul, in particular, he's worked at this for about, a minute. Maybe like 30 seconds, maybe about 30 seconds less time than his brother. Now, let's face it, Jake Paul, he's kind of, let's just say he's the Fredo of the Paul brothers. He is the weaker of the two. He's the guy that the family kind of has to try to protect from himself if they can. So, while Logan Paul is going on to have an exhibition fight with Floyd Mayweather, which to me seems absurd, but at the very least, he's at least being respectful of his opponent, which is something that Jake Paul certainly wasn't with Nate Robinson. I do think at this point that they are well aware of the detail that Jake Paul is trying to bite off way more than he can chew. Even if he's not aware of it. Now, I saw an interview here this week where he was talking about the prospects of fighting Conor McGregor. And the things that he had to say, I think, really tell you a lot about the kind of person that Jake Paul is. He was going on about how, Conor's older than me. Conor's outside of his prime. Conor's smaller than me. All kinds of things like that. And it comes back to that little thing again. Jake Paul, as an alleged professional boxer, he's not out trying to fight the best people that he thinks are the best people for him to fight. He's out there looking for people that he thinks are smaller than him, people that he thinks are weaker than him. people that he thinks are people who are older than him, so he thinks that they're going to be slower than him. In the case of and in the case of Conor McGregor, he's got pretty much all of that entirely wrong. Conor McGregor, he might be a smaller fighter, but if you get in the ring with him, he's going to knock you the fuck out. But not only does it speak to that delusion, but quite frankly, it also speaks to that sense of entitlement. That sense of entitlement that he thinks that he's entitled to just buy himself into the sport, buy himself into these big money fights, and not even have to fight guys in his weight class. I mean, Nate Paul, his weight, his in-ring weight kind of hovers right around 205. In boxing, that's a middleweight. In MMA, that would be a light heavyweight. So if he were serious about being a competitive pro boxer in any kind of a respectable sense, then he should be going out and looking for opponents at light heavyweight and at middleweight. But he's not. He's out looking for guys who are 150 pounds. He's a heavyweight trying to fight lightweights. Now, if he were any kind of a serious fighter, that might actually be a reasonable way of just being able to rack up some cheap wins. But now when you look at the guys that want a piece of Jake Paul, I mean, Conor McGregor, I don't think he's going to indulge it. I think he's going to focus on chasing after that lightweight championship of the world, because really at the end of the day, that's what matters. But there are all kinds of guys who aren't currently in, title picture type fights right now that have actually come out and said that they would love to take on Jake Paul. The latest was Yoel Romero. Romero would kill him, would absolutely murder him. Nate Diaz has come out and said that he wants to fight him. Nate Diaz would kill him. Yeah, Dana White has actually come out and said that he wants to feed Jake Paul to Amanda Nunes. And I don't think that Amanda Nunes would knock out Jake Paul early in a fight. I think it would have to happen somewhere in the later rounds, but quite frankly, I think that, as the fight wears on, as the damage becomes cumulative, over 12 rounds, yeah, I think that Amanda Nunes would put Jake Paul away. I mean, hey, she's no Nate Robinson, but who is, right? I mean, you have to take this for what it is. This is Jake Paul. He knocked out Nate Robinson, and now he's walking around acting like he thinks he knocked out Sugar Ray Robinson. Now, there's other things that are going on now. I mean, there was his stunt with Dylan Dennis. I've got people there telling me that they're pretty sure that whole thing was a setup. Whether they meant that, whether that means that Dylan Dennis himself was in on the whole stunt where Jake Paul basically showed up in the back of a truck and ambushed him and threw water balloons at him and then took off like a chicken shit. I mean, whether he was in on the whole thing, or whether, there are also theories that Brendan Schaub basically just stooged off his location to Jake Paul. I find that one very difficult to swallow. But a lot of people seem to think that one is strictly a setup, so I'm not going to get too deep into that one. But the one thing that I will say about it is that if it wasn't a setup, if that whole thing was legit, and he's actually running around doing that kind of stuff, I mean, it is very, very, it's just exceedingly unlikely that Jake Paul is ever going to make it to another stupid YouTube boxing mud show. For the record, mud show, that's a pro wrestling term for these. You kind of see these things pop up, clips on them show up on YouTube every so often of just these, these backyard wrestling matches that people have where everybody's untrained and nobody's a real professional. That's what Jake Paul does as a boxer. And he's a mud show boxer. He's not really legit. And unfortunately, I think that until boxing figures out that you cannot actually build a business like this off of actively and continually just disgusting your fans, the way that they did this past Saturday, I think that there's going to be more of this, and I think it's going to get worse before it gets any better.